How do you consume in this system without falling into like the shopping trap? Like you just need to go buy the next thing.
Really got to consider like what are the needs that I have that aren't being met, and why am I funneling it through these things that I actually don't need?
The term food desert, it implies, like a desert is like a natural phenomenon. It just exists because nature did it that way. So a more accurate term would be something like food apartheid, because this is really like we have a lack of access to these types of foods for a reason, because of the economics of it. And, that's not looking out for the welfare of the people that live in those communities. You also have to consider the workers who are producing the products.
This can lead to a lot of different health issues, mental health issues, physical health issues. There's lots of trauma that's involved in being in like a slaughterhouse or a sweatshop or something.
In our modern world that's built to sell things and buy things and consume and eat and shop and buy and shop and buy and shop.
If you're not paying, then you're the product. And I think that a lot of the media that we end up getting seems to be quote unquote free, right? But it's actually not.
Who's the agenda setter? Who's the gatekeeper? Who are the people that are crafting the messages, not just the talking head on the screen. It's the moneyed interests that are funding it. We just want to encourage people to think a little bit more deeply about how the food ends up on their plate and how the clothes end up on their back. Hello and welcome to the Radical Empaths podcast. I'm Josh.
And I'm Liz.
And on this show, we're exploring and analyzing our cultural norms
and questioning our society's intricacies with thoughtful nuances.
We're inquiring about the legitimacy of conventional and orthodox ways of thinking and observing the strange traditions that they create.
We'll be taking a mindful and sensitive approach to create some deeper meaning out of all of our discussions.
Yes, we will. And this discussion here today is one that has been a long time coming. It's kind of one of the main reasons why we wanted to start this podcast. It's something that we both talk about a lot. It occupies a lot of space in our minds. And it's the topic, as you know, because of the title of the podcast, mindful consumption. And like a lot of things that we talk about here, there's a lot involved in that, and we can go in many different directions. And we probably won't have time to cover everything that we want to say about it today, but there's still plenty of great conversation to be had revolving the way that we consume in our modern world that's built to sell things and buy things and consume and eat and shop and buy and shop and buy and shop, and how to make some meaning out of all of that, because that's kind of the point of what we like to talk about here. So with all that said, this is something that I know Liz specifically has thought a lot about, because they've kind of prompted a lot of the discussion that has happened between us here in our household, talking about these mindful consumption issues and just thinking deeper about them and finding all the different ways that they impact our lives. So, Liz, what are the things, like what are the experiences that you've had in your childhood and in your life, and then, in your adult life as well, that have kind of led you in the path that you're on to have the opinions that you have today, and what makes you feel so, strongly about wanting to share them today?
Well, like being a sensitive kid or a sensitive child, and then, also identifying as an HSP, a highly sensitive person still today, it was really too easy for me to be, influenced, and my brain to be seeing the commercials that I was advertised to and all the media that I consumed on TV as like idealistic and basically like hypnotic in a way.
By design.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that like all of us have to a certain extent have been like conditioned by what's on TV or what we're seeing on the internet or social media, or, just things that we are purchasing on different platforms. So yeah, that's the first part I would say, just in regards to the
That's a huge part of mindful consumption, I think, is what you're trying to say.
Yeah. The media aspect.
Yeah. It's
of
consumption
what we
isn't
consume.
just tangible objects. It's not just food or clothes or household items. It's also all the information that you might take in.
Yes.
And the mediums of information that you would, whether you're reading or watching or listening. And, you're consuming this right now. So we hope that you're doing it mindfully.
Right. And I guess like a story I would share, an example would be like when I was a child, I had some conflicting emotions about some of my consumption choices in terms of eating and the food that I had and the relationship that I had with food. So eating meat was normal for me as a kid. I was not vegetarian. Omnivore, standard American diet. My mom was, however, she was vegetarian. And still is a vegan actually now. So I knew that she had not wanted anything to do with the smells of certain meat products or certain quote unquote foods that I love to eat. So I would second guess choosing those foods when I would be with her and opt for a turkey burger rather than a beef burger because I knew that the smell of the turkey would be easier for her to deal with. And eventually I think that some of these kinds of mental and emotional conflicts really did grow into something so large that I couldn't ignore it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that moment. We were together and I was real content ignoring every part of my diet and the foods that I was eating and the impacts that they were having. And when you decided to stop ignoring it, I had my cognitive dissonance triggered and I really didn't want to stop ignoring it either. But that led us both on a path, I think, that leads us to here talking right now about this very subject. Because, that's you have a unique experience with your mom being vegetarian in your childhood, because I think that's, us, we grew up in the 2000s and it wasn't as common or prevalent then for people to not be eating meat. It's probably a little bit more common today than it was then. So I definitely didn't have the same type of experience. I grew up and just I ate all kinds of meat and it was just normal. It's not like it's something that you question in that moment. A fish doesn't question the water. They just swim in it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, you have an interesting perspective to share about that then, and that was something to push you towards questioning your consumption choices a little bit more, which that's good. It's something that kids should be doing more often. I think I wish that I had been a little bit more questioning when I was younger. And then, so you obviously you grew up and then you went to college and you were at UB, University of Buffalo. And you did some, in your time there, do you want to talk a little bit about what it is that you did that made you question this stuff a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So I was in a communications course and it was really interesting where we were assigned something where we were able to write articles. And we basically chose a goal from the UN's Sustainable Development goals, and I chose living in harmony with nature, which sounds nice, right? Like everybody wants that. I feel like that was a good goal for me to choose. And this is what sparked my interest in doing like deeper research and knowing more about mindful consumption. Yeah. That's
cool. So I remember like you were conducting surveys and stuff like that with people and kind of connecting people's opinions about how they connect with nature, with how they consume their foods and how they consume other things, and kind of led you more into the path of, like how people's mindsets question or how people's mindsets determine the amount that they question what they're eating and what they're purchasing and all different aspects of their lives. And Liz did some cool Liz wrote a couple of articles and did some cool research and writing, as they mentioned, doing a couple of articles in medium.com. We're going to link those in the description. Some titles of the articles: Veganism, Mitigating or Perpetuating Climate Disaster, and Our Future Relies on Biodiversity. And there's some more on there too. And those, and we're going to get into some of these topics a little bit now, like, and how they're all related and connected. And yeah, so like I said, there's a lot to get into. So yeah, before we dive into it, is there any other things that you want to mention about like your experiences and like why you feel so strongly about this topic for people to learn more about?
Well, I think it's all encompassing. I think that everybody can say that they're on this journey of making the right choices and feeling good about what you are buying. Ultimately, you want to feel good about the things that you buy and the things that you're intaking and ingesting and consuming. And I think we're human beings, not human thinkings. We gotta
Mm,
we have to put ourselves in that kind of perspective. A lot of times we are too busy thinking. So
right,
it's kind of good to be in the moment when you're doing these kinds of purchases or consuming certain types of media or whatever it is.
right.
So
Well, I like to combine both of them because you're right. Like, I like that. It's clever. We're
mhm,
human beings, not human thinkings, right? So just
mhm.
existing in the moment, but doing it in a way that's going to align with your morals and align with what you feel is the right thing to do. Sometimes I think requires a little bit of human thinking. So that's where some of maybe the historical context comes in of understanding how we got here, where we are. Not just that everything that exists in a vacuum and we just operate this way because that's the way it is, but understanding how things were put together and how the chessboard was laid out before any of us were even born.
I wanted to hear more from you, Josh, about the historical context or maybe some of the aspects that have driven us to think, why do we do what we do? And how have we gotten here through the, history of consumption?
The history of consumption. Wow. How long do we want the podcast to be? Well, I think that the thing that I want to highlight the most and talk about, and I think is really important for everyone to keep in mind when thinking about the way that we consume in the world that we live in now, is that we live in an industrialized capitalist market economy, in the Western world. I mean, that's assuming that you're with us here in the United States listening or somewhere in Europe or, we all know the industrialized countries and all that stuff in the Western world.
Right.
And absolutely not excluding others. Everyone is welcome here, of course. We're kind of critiquing the way of life that has been set by the predominant Western culture. So that's what we are. So stick with us and hear what we got. But so yeah, what I think that our modern perspective in our culture kind of purposefully hides or inadvertently forgets the history that gets us here. It's a history of colonialism and industrial capitalism that over the past couple of centuries, but really kickstarted in the last like 75 years since the end of World War II, and United States kind of took over as the world power.
Hmm.
It really went into overdrive of creating a super commercialized and materialistic market economy that really values buying the next thing and home goods, and everyone has one of everything and you got to have the new thing. That's a trait of this market economy that continues and has only gotten stronger as time has gone on. So something to think about, that in the past, when people who were thinking of economies and how to shape societies, they kind of came to this idea of like a split, a dichotomy, that the history of market economies, right? They have had this split between, on one hand, you have like an industrialized market economy, like a capitalist economy, living with lots of wealth, lots of decadence. Everyone gets what they want, and they can be gluttonous, and it sounds nice to people. And on the other side, having more independent kind of communal system. Some might call it communist, but we don't need to put labels to it. Which would consist of like kind of small groups of people that have a common set of interests and goals. And in that system, you may be living with some sort of less degree of wealth, maybe more poverty, but you might be living with more virtue and more strong community bonds. So
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Is it predominantly the wealth and decadence that we live under in this?
What made you guess?
I just was wondering. And also it just seems like it's something to ask about is, do you think that there's commercialization added to that aspect of wealth and decadence? Like, are we producing more and more and more of something that we just don't need that many of? Overproduction, maybe?
Yeah, totally. That's a huge part of it. That's kind of the way that it has evolved into the future, like maybe like what I was saying, when this dichotomy, this split was created like a couple hundred of years ago, the people who were creating the market, the thinkers, the philosophers who were coming up with the ways of conducting the society, they probably couldn't have predicted the way that things would progress and the way that we have industrialization and, like you mentioned, mass production, overproduction, and that, that alludes to the word decadence that we used, right? Like just creating more than we need just for the sake of having it, to create this like illusion of comfort that everyone can have something. And, obviously it's a whole separate podcast, but we know that that's not the way that it's worked out. Like just because there's a lot of a Tesla doesn't mean that everyone can buy the Tesla or enter in whatever expensive commercial good we have there. We obviously have it creates some sort of a hierarchical system for earners. But anyways, that's a whole other conversation. Talking just about like commercialization and consumerism. It's the reason I wanted to say all this is because I think that it's really healthy and important to have that background, that it has stemmed from colonialization and from capitalism and from, the driving Judeo-Christian forces that kind of come in and implement the ideas that they want in our cultures throughout our history and all over the world, and set the predominant narrative that they want people to follow, and all of the consequences that come with that. So that's kind of what we want to talk about. So with all that said, it's like society has been built to consume, like buy more, buy, shop, shop, shop. And so the question is how do we fulfill all of our needs as humans, who obviously have to participate in the system that's been built here for us, that we live within, that obviously does have some virtue. It's not like we're doom and gloom and we say everything's terrible. Like it can create good things. But how do you consume in this system without falling into like the shopping trap? Like you just need to go buy the next thing. How do you not fall into the lack of mindfulness trap, where you just are buying things and you're consuming things just because? And, there's lots of forces out there that are trying to get you to do these things. So and we'll talk about all these. So,
and how do we remain mindful consumers within this system?
Yeah, exactly. Right? Like it's a giant system, and it's a lot of moving parts all at the same time. So how do you keep your head above water and remain mindful, at least in the best ways that you can?
We're here to list some of those for you.
That's right. So yeah, I mean, what are like the ways that you feel most important? Obviously, we've kind of talked about veganism on this show, so.
I mean, I would break it up into a few different groups. I mean, everyone's going to have their own way of kind of dissecting or compartmentalizing the ways that they consume, based on your lifestyle, based on your culture and your, relationships that you have, and the labels that you hold for yourself. I think that all contributes to what you're going to consume. But for today, I think it would be cool to talk about personal health, the animals, the environment, and the workers and farmers, and also maybe some clothing and additional media sources that we will go over, just as different categories for what we consume and the ways that people are, and other non-human animals are affected by our decisions.
Right.
Right.
Well, yeah, let's start there then. Non-human animals, how they're affected by our decisions. Like we said, like we try to relate lots of these things back to veganism because it's a really important part of this podcast and the reasons that we have these kinds of discussions. So yeah, I mean, with animals for food, there's all types of examples that we could go to. I think I personally, just for the sake of this podcast, I want to talk about the ones that people like. I think that people can get the idea, like eating meat is bad for the animals. The animal has to die. They can wrap their head around it. The ones that I get a little bit more trickier is when you're talking about dairy, you're talking about eggs and honey, and then other things that become not vegan, like animals for lab testing and for clothing. So,
and even bugs that where there's the shellacking candy and chocolate products.
yeah, explain that for people who might not know what's that word, shellac?
Shellac, yeah, it's the some sort of bug ingredient. It's like goo that is added to make candy shiny. So the vegan candy doesn't have that shine to it. It's not like purely shiny and perfect because they don't have the bug goo. But it tastes delicious, the vegan candy. So
yeah, that's kind of the impact of, advertising and marketing.
Mindful consumption. The more you know, the better you do.
You can be more mindful. Now maybe you don't want to buy the one that has the bug coating on the outside of it.
And also the wild animals that are kept in captivity or in zoos, aquariums, petting zoos, things like that.
Yeah, services. And I mean, and then also things for clothing, like there's leather.
Of course.
Obviously, leather is horrific, and wool. That's one.
The list goes on and on with what people do in terms of animal products.
Right. Well, yeah, I think the reason that I wanted to focus on that specifically is because people can generally get the idea of like, if you're eating the animal, that's obviously not good for the animal. But one like wool, people have like more of a nuanced opinion on it because they're like, oh, well, it's a symbiotic thing because that the wool needs to be taken from they can't just keep growing it. Like it needs to be taken off of them and they're doing them a favor. And like, while that, physiologically is true, you have to also consider the fact that humans over generations have bred them to produce more wool. And, they don't necessarily have a symbiotic relationship because the only reason that they have them is in order to profit off of, materials that come from them.
Right.
So that's like a way of parsing it out and trying to understand why vegans might, why are you against wool? Like, is it on the level of moral outrage? Is it the same thing as a steak and leather? Like, probably not, but it's the principle of it, which is if we're looking at these animals as not something to provide us with a product to commoditize, then you can just look at them as a partner. And, if it's your friend and you're just taking the wool off because you don't want them to be really warm, then that's cool. But what's happening to the sheep? That's what I'm wondering. But
well, my question is, by connecting the animals and all of their byproducts into things that people consume, what would be like the benefits, that we have from eating like a whole food plant-based diet, having more mindful consumption in that way, in terms of like personal health? Like, can you think of like the examples that?
Yeah. I mean, there's
benefits. There's obviously lots of them.
There's all kinds of them. And I think we mentioned this on our last podcast, but if you want like a really comprehensive, in-depth look, go to nutritionfacts.org or listen to Nutrition Facts with Dr. Michael Greger. He talks about all this stuff in super detail,
Link
very
in bio.
specific. There's endless content to learn more and more. But generally speaking, and if you ask me specifically, like one of the main things for me was like, I had high blood pressure and I had high cholesterol as like a 19-year-old. And that doesn't seem natural. And I have, heart disease in my family history. And, for me, it's just, it is a no-brainer there's no cholesterol found in plant foods. Like the only reason that you have high cholesterol is because you eat animal products. That's where cholesterol comes from. So I don't have a cholesterol problem anymore. And I also don't have a high blood pressure problem anymore. So that's for me personally, but also obviously eating a whole food plant-based diet can impact in so many other ways. Like I mentioned, heart disease and diabetes and, meats are a carcinogen. So, preventative for cancer in the future, potentially.
There's well-known studies out where they compare eating chicken or eating meat to smoking cigarettes. So that's readily available information. Again, like Josh mentioned, Dr. Michael Greger talks a lot about that, and we will link that in the bio.
Quick side note about that. I remember when that came out, like I think specifically it was like bacon could be the same thing as cigarettes, something like that, because of the carcinogens. And I remember seeing that. And at the time I smoked cigarettes. This was when I was like probably 18, 19. And I remember thinking like, oh, bacon is the same as cigarettes. Like, all right, well, I smoke cigarettes, so let's double it up. Who cares? But that, my friends, is an example of non-mindful consumption. So that's part of what this podcast is as well, is kind of a crusade.
Thank you for the example of non-mindful consumption.
Yes. It's a crusade to try to right the wrongs of the past and some of the things that we, the flaws in our thinking in the past that we like to talk about now. So we're not infallible people. we don't like to preach from on high. So
and now we're going to get into the environmental aspects of mindful consumption. And one topic that I'd like to talk about, let's talk about biodiversity.
Let's do it.
Layla Jana is the author of Where Did the Wild Things Go? And this article is something I read in my research for mindful consumption articles that I wrote that were mentioned earlier. So she speaks about experiencing the signals of biodiversity struggling and shifting in our mainstream culture. Have you ever gone to like a Whole Foods or a Wegmans or whatever your local grocery store is, and you see some exotic fruit that's marketed as high in vitamins or super limited? These words and products were not necessarily harvested by people or countries who are taken care of or paid fairly or in, safe conditions at all. She also mentions how surrounding yourself in nature is one of the top ways to get your brain thinking about what's going on in the world around you and even beyond you. So it's a good way to kind of connect in unison with everything that's going on, even if you're not physically, with those experiences or people that may be struggling. So,
yeah, I mean,
interesting.
It sounds like just the concept of like solidarity. Like if you're going to go and you're going to buy acai or pitaya for your smoothie bowl, like we do, you shouldn't do that without having at least some sort of respect and understanding for the culture that's come from. And obviously that being like the Amazonian rainforest, South America. And like I mentioned before, like we have our Western cultures here, like the US and Europe and Australia and, and then there's like the global South countries that kind of produce lots of the goods that end up supplying us here. So it's good if you're going to be consuming those types of products, you should, at the very least, you should understand the cultures that they come from, traditionally, what the ways that those foods were used, and the benefits that they have to you for your health. And then also as well, a really important part of that is like making sure wherever you can that you're finding like fair trade things so that like Liz mentioned, like the workers, are being treated properly and like that the local communities aren't being displaced or
uprooted and
or poisoned with byproducts of the cultivation of whatever product that we're talking about.
Right.
And that goes for grains and that goes for fruits and vegetables and that goes for industrial goods. It goes for everything. So like, but we're talking, we're kind of talking about the environment broadly. So just industrialized mass production in general, having a good idea of the way that the environment's being impacted by the mass-produced products that you're purchasing, because obviously we can't avoid every single mass-produced product and imported fruits and veggies and stuff. It's a part of our diets and we live in this culture and in this time. But trying to find ways to be mindful consumers of all of those things is like a super important thing. And yeah, and like another part of that, like we mentioned, is the workers and the farmers, and like specifically knowing that the workers it's hard to know for sure, but like trying to find out what the standards are for, types of food products that you're purchasing and, historically what types of mispractices may have been done in those areas and in those industries.
Right.
So like, and I guess moving on from food, like that goes to like clothing, because like sweatshops is notorious. So like
any products, this is a wide range spectrum. I think I definitely agree with that. There's high demands and pressure and like increased stress levels of the people that are placed in these types of factories and facilities. So, I mean, this can lead to a lot of different health issues, whether that's mental health issues, physical health issues. There's lots of trauma that's involved in being in like a slaughterhouse or a sweatshop or something, like where you're not being paid fairly or given proper, you're in an unsanitary facility or somewhere that's not up to inspections. So this is obviously going to lead to a lot of problems, and there's a lot of economic immobility and strain that goes with, small towns that have a Walmart and a giant meat packing factory. And those are the two places that you can work. Right. And if you don't work there, then you don't make a living and your family doesn't survive. So,
and you could be lots of these people could be undocumented immigrants as well. And, and talking about all these things and having like a holistic view of everything that could go into the food that you're eating, the goods that you're purchasing. It's super important to think about all these things.
And I will just add, like, this is kind of also a result being of white supremacy, like of thinking about people that, they are not able to get access to the whole food, plant-based foods that we're able to get access to so often. They don't have a grocery store like a Whole Foods or a Wegmans, and even if they do, it's too expensive, and they're not able to access those foods that we are. So it's just good to recognize that in our veganism and be humble and saying that we don't think that everyone has access to the lifestyle that we choose to live. And we're very fortunate for being able to get those things.
Yeah.
So,
well, I want to say about that, because I think people are familiar with the term food desert.
Yeah.
It's pretty commonly heard. And we were recently listening to another podcast. It's called How to Vegan. And she mentioned something interesting that I'd like to relay on here, because I think it's really was very insightful and it stuck with me, is that in talking about the term food desert, which is kind of what Liz was just mentioning, is like these communities, they might not have access to whole food, plant-based things. They might have access to lots of like packaged, frozen, processed foods, and fast food chains as well,
preservatives and all
right.
that stuff,
all that's by design. And so the term food desert, it's interesting because it implies, like a desert is like a natural phenomenon. It's like a geological thing that just exists because nature did it that way. But that's not the food system that we live within. So calling it a food desert is it's kind of whitewashes it a little bit. So a more accurate term would be something like food apartheid, because this is really like, we have a lack of access to these types of foods for a reason, because of the economics of it. And, that's not looking out for the welfare of the people that live in those communities, who, are all of our, we're all one, we're all part of the same community. So we should, try to have the same types of standards everywhere, and rather than restricting and limiting those types of products. And, we could get more into detail about how it's done. We make it seem like there's like a group of world leaders meeting in a submarine underwater, twirling their mustaches and pulling the strings. It's a little bit more nuanced and complicated than that, and it would take a while to get into it. But the idea being like Liz said, like, and that goes back to white supremacy, because like, what are the communities that this is happening to? They're the minority communities, the people of color, BIPOC. Right. So it's super important to have that in mind. And because while we want to be empathetic to the animals and to the earth and to all of the workers and the industries and the communities around the industries that are producing these products, we also want to be empathetic to the people who, like Liz said, may not be able to afford this way of life. Right. We all are living within a system. We have to have empathy and solidarity for people that are crushed underneath, under the boot of the same system that we're all underneath.
You got to punch up, not down.
That's exactly right. So I think that's a super not interesting. It's an important perspective to add to this, because, we definitely don't want to be turning our noses at people who choose not to live this way. We just want to encourage people to think a little bit more deeply about how the food ends up on their plate and how the clothes end up on their back, and how the world keeps on turning, and why things operate the way that they do, and how to inform their decisions a little bit better from there.
So going from there, we will jump into clothing. I think we should talk about that a little bit
we've
more.
kind of been bouncing around it. We can talk about it more specifically.
All right. I mean, I think it would be fun to start with you and ask you, in the situation where you're able to find clothing for yourself, what are your first steps?
Oh man.
What do you look for?
Well, for me, like we're not particularly economically well off, but that's why we have this level of solidarity and understanding and empathy for people who
We feel ya.
We feel you, trust me.
Oh, we feel ya.
I mean, like this is something I've always felt, but like, a good way to save a little bit of money and to maybe not be as worried about the morality of the sourcing is to do some thrifting.
Yes.
Because you're recycling and you're reusing, then at that point that's definitely a good tip, and you can get better deals. And if you're broke, you probably already know that. So
but it's also very fun, isn't it? Because we can find, sometimes I really have found some of the best things that I have in thrift shops.
Yeah.
Pair of jeans.
It's very satisfying too. Like anything that I've ever found in a thrift store that I love, I'm like more proud of that than I am like something that I bought online. So other than thrifting, there's other ways. Like if you're not down for thrifting, if you're gonna, if you like buying clothes that haven't been worn by other people and aren't dirty, then maybe you can find some clothes online from ethically sourced places. There's different ways to do that, and I know that like Liz, you definitely have done this before, and you have some thoughts on this. So what are your? Let me ask you the same question. Like thinking about clothes and fashion and maintaining the mindful consumption ethics that we're talking about here. How you do it? What's your strategy?
My first and foremost feeling with clothing and fashion and, just some of the things that I experienced when I was younger with clothes, like you just got to wear things that feel good. And I think that that can go a lot of different directions. But to me, this can be highly controversial just because like not all things are vegan, right? Like people wear leather and it's you're great, they love it. But it's like, personally, my approach is that if you own something that is not technically vegan or ethically sourced, you have to be aware of this. I think that that's very important because your awareness is the greatest tool for the potential shift in the purchase decision next time. Next time, you might make a different decision because you are aware of where, what things are made of that you have and where they come from. So I think that that's very important. And if it's still in good use, I say just keep using it. Don't replace something that doesn't need to be replaced. I think that that's, needless waste. But that's again, that's my personal philosophy on it. Like if you have, my best examples are like leather, like we keep saying, jackets and couches and purses and shoes and bags and like Canada Goose and wool and suede and all that stuff.
I got a good example with wool because I was just talking about wool before, and this is a good example of what Liz is talking about right now because one time we went for a hike. I didn't know about wicking socks or hiking socks. I got some gnarly blisters on my feet. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to buy some wicking socks. And I bought so they're very nice and they work very well to not get blisters. And then I found out that they're made of wool, but I already have them. So do I throw them out and buy new socks? That's silly. No, I still have them. I keep them and I wear them because it's not like they've gone bad. It's just that I know that next time when I get wicking socks, I'm going to try to find an alternative that might be not wool.
Yeah, and I don't think that people should feel so guilty about the things that they already own that they end up just throwing everything out. And I mean, who has money to replace everything like that? Like nobody can just like, flip their entire wardrobe. So I definitely have understanding with that. But the more you know, the better you do. And I think that if you are aware of those things, that's like the best tool. That's the first step.
That's the mantra. When you know better, you do better.
Right.
So Yeah, I mean, that's just thinking about that kind of a perspective for people who are like vegan or going vegan or interested in the idea of it, but like yeah, you don't, it doesn't mean you have to get rid of like, oh, do I have vegan now? Do I have to throw out my couch because it's made of leather? Like, no, but maybe next time if you need a new couch, you know better this time. So that's part of the mission here, is just like helping you to think deeply about these things if you haven't before.
And you also had some thoughts on fast fashion.
Yeah, it's like a whole other side of this too, because like we can talk about the animals, but then like we said before, like in being a mindful consumer, you also have to consider the workers who are producing the products, the communities who are impacted by the production of those products, and the earth and the climate and
The
the
environment,
ecology in that area. So
right?
yeah, fast fashion. There's lots of research to be done on it. There's a lot to say about it, but just like kind of a quick rundown. I mean, you know more about it. Like, what are some like examples of like fast fashion retailers?
I mean, I can just think of the main one that I think of now is Sheen. I don't know if you know that one, but
Mm,
I've gotten a couple things from there, honestly, and both of them went through the wash once and were totally unusable by the next time I wanted to wear it. There was like a rip in one of them, and then the other one, I couldn't figure out how to actually put the shirt back together. It was like in two pieces. So
hmm.
I don't really know. I just think that the quality definitely is going to go down when you buy things like that. And you have to be kind of asking yourself, like, do I need this?
Yeah,
Do I actually need this right now? Like,
yeah,
so that's like that's a side note, but that's a
yeah.
good
I was just gonna
example.
say, side note. I like that you brought that up because it shows that like we're talking all about how you should not buy these things and how you should be more mindful, but like Liz already made that mistake, and we learned by experience. So it's
Yeah.
we're it's not like it's a hypocritical thing to admit that
No.
we have purchased these things before. It's more of like we're fallible people and we've learned from our experiences, and that's kind of, we're trying to have a conversation about that. So yeah, I mean, that as a, I guess Sheen, I've never heard of that before. I'm not really like a fashion per. I don't like buy stuff. Like I said, I like to thrift. So, but yeah, I mean, they're designed. It's like a whole marketing strategy, where it's like it's not like they make a shirt and then that's the shirt and they have it for like a while, and it's like no, they create something. They do a limited amount of it, so they stir up some hype on it, and then they have people go buy it. Like Liz said, it's terrible quality, so it's going to rip right away. People are going to buy new ones. As soon as it's sold out, they move right on to the next thing. They're constantly churning, they're constantly producing. They're designed to keep you coming back to the next thing. They're creating wastefulness. And then like on top of that, obviously there's like a whole bunch of other stuff with workers and the environment, but like what do you want to say about the fashion and like the marketing of it and like how they keep bringing people back? Like
Oh, I mean, I think it can become an addictive habit for certain people, shopping addictions and
yeah.
materialism and all that stuff. I mean, that's definitely a serious issue. I mean, it has a lot to do with mental health too. I mean, all
Mhm.
that stuff you'd really got to consider, like, what are the needs that I have that aren't being met, and why am I funneling it through these things that I actually don't need?
Yeah.
So that's kind of
Yeah, and
an
we're
interesting perspective of it, I would say.
yeah, wherever there
But
is that you know, mental vulnerability, there will be someone there trying to exploit it and earn a dollar. And that's kind of what this whole conversation is about. So, because on top of that, in fast fashion, there's the workers, they work long hours, terrible working conditions. They're in sweatshops, and like the dyes that are in the clothes, they poison the water supplies for the local indigenous communities, like all around really not a good thing to participate in. And if you can avoid it, you should try to avoid it and get things that might have more longevity. The term is planned obsolescence. Like they make things so that they will be done soon, and you want to buy another one because they want to keep selling you the next thing. So trying to avoid that and falling into the shopping trap, as we called it earlier, is like an important thing to keep in mind. Um, so that kind of, we can stick a pin in fashion and clothing. There's a lot there to talk about, but we think that you probably get the idea. So moving on to one other thing that is like a critical part of this conversation, which is how we consume media generally, and that meaning, what we read, what we watch on TV, what we listen to, the way that we go on social media. So, I mean, I guess we should, full disclosure, talk about like what our media consumption habits are. So like what are your personal preferences for your media consumption?
I feel like I got to ask myself questions when it comes to media consumption. There's some questions that come up like what kind of energy and people do I want to attract, Like where can I spend my time to feel most fulfilled? Where can I utilize my energy to feel, like I, have that room for growth? And like what information do I need in order to grow more? So I think that those are like some important questions that I end up coming to in terms of what I'm going to consume, media wise or, especially media wise, but in other ways too, like with foods and things like that. Um, and also in terms of like information, I think it's important to like question even, is this information accurate and reliable, or does it give me a weird vibe? Like make sure that when you're learning or when you're trying to be in a growth mindset that you're in it and that you're present and that you're not like being distracted by other, stressors or, things that just happen in life. So I think it's just important to get the most out of what you're looking at so that you can look at it with like a critical eye, because it's really easy to just, like read something and be like, oh yeah, that's true because I read that. And it's like, but did you dig deeper if you needed to? Like, I think a lot of people need to dig deeper if you need to, because like there's a lot of like misinformation and malinformation out there because it's so easier than ever right now to like in all of history to get information from different places around the world. So just something to think about.
Yeah, the market is saturated.
Right.
Yeah, I have lots to say about this because I mean, like you said, like the first question that you should maybe be asking yourself when you are seeking out media of all forms is like what kind of energy do I want to be attracting? Like what types of messages do I want to be taking in right now? So like just think of that in general. And with that question, then kind of should make you analyze social media habits, because obviously social media doesn't particularly allow you to choose. I mean, it does because you can set your preferences, and over time algorithms will learn what you like to see. But the concept of an algorithm, a man-made design tool that's there to attract your attention and to make you consume not mindfully so that you stay on as long as possible, that they can show you another ad and sell you something. Like that's the goal of these platforms. And if you've ever seen the documentary, The Social Dilemma, it's the kind of the thesis of that is like, if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. They're taking your attention and they're selling it to other people. So a huge part of being a mindful consumer on social media means understanding that fact and like knowing how to navigate in that environment, knowing full well that you're the product, your attention is. So they're rooting for it. They want you to not be mindful. They want you to just sit there and scroll.
Stay there as long as you possibly are able to.
Yeah, that's their goal. All by design. Yeah. So I mean, but the othave part of that, that's social media. I mean, we just full disclaimer, we don't really like use social media personally. Like we have had them in the past. We use them for like practical purposes. Like if I need to sell something, I use Facebook Marketplace or whatever, and we check things out on Instagram to see what deals are going on or whatever. But just in terms of sitting there and scrolling, I try to definitely avoid that because I just personally don't find too much value in doing that kind of thing. And I don't want to be, put in a capitalist's box of what they're trying to sell to me, because usually they're right. I don't like it.
I think maybe the really important thing to close out here with is setting intentions when you're doing things like that. Like if you're going to be on social media, if you're a business owner, or if you're, that's just the best example I can think of, because to be a business owner, I think that social media is kind of almost critical
Oh, yeah.
in certain situations. So lots of situations you're going to need to be on social media, and setting those intentions before you do, or you're even just an influencer, or you're, a yoga instructor, or just anything where you got to put yourself out there in the world. Set your intentions of, I have a goal of why I'm here, and I'm not here for, the distractions of the world around me. Maybe I want to connect with certain people, and collaborate with certain people, but am I using this to compare myself? Am I using this to, cause myself detrimental, harm? Am
Yeah.
I just sitting here for however long a day scrolling, and, not really learning or gaining anything from it? I think those are important distinguishers, because a lot of people are able to use social media in a healthy way and have a healthy relationship with it. But
Yeah.
you have to understand that you are the product if you're not paying. And that is like a really good point, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And that kind of drives the way that we look at it and think about it. And I guess before we close, like there's another important part of this too with media consumption that I wanted to make sure I get to throw in here. And that's something you kind of started touching on, but it's a term that means a lot to me based on my experiences in college, which was at Buff State back in like 2016, 2017. And I was a media student, and I studied all about like communication. And I've kind of been like a media critic since then, because I learned a lot and changed a lot of my perspectives on how information is presented to us in the news, and like, TV news specifically, but like in written news as well. And this idea of media literacy, like how to have the framework to learn something and to know the way, like who's the agenda setter, who's the gatekeeper, who are the people that are crafting the messages that are being, it's not just the talking head on the screen. It's the wide range of managers and the moneyed interests that are funding it. Something to keep in mind when you're getting all of, if you don't want to, it's good to always have, my opinion on this is, it's good to always have a very well-rounded media diet. You don't want to find yourself finding one trusted source that's the source that you go to for everything, and that's the voice. It's good to get a varied diet of different types of media. Don't where the radical part of the radical empath for me comes in here is like, don't necessarily just think that means that you go to what is considered to be the most credible by like a cultural standard. Because in a lot of situations, a lot of the mainstream media, written or TV, have a lot of corporate funding, and there's a lot of interesting types of, like, I want to give an example of one that I think is really important based on something that I think about a lot, and maybe we'll talk about in future episodes. But I was reading an article on Politico about the war in Ukraine, and I noticed off to the side there's an ad from Lockheed Martin, which is like a weapons company. They like produce like guns and bullets and ammo and planes and stuff. And they're advertising a plane and a fighter jet on the sidebar of this article.
How much?
Yeah, right. It's like, how much? Oh, I'm in the market for one of those. Let me get one of those. That's so silly. It just seems like such a like just right out in the open. Like, because who are they advertising that to? Like, no, to me that looks like just kind of like an open bribe. They're like, hey, we would benefit well from saying things that would kind of push people towards wanting more war so that we can produce more weapons. And, that is going to be good for our bottom line. And like, that's a trend that's been seen for a long time in the media. So like, that's a huge topic. We can talk about that another time. I have a lot to say about it, but the main point of that being like, where's the funding for some of the media coming from that you're consuming, and how are the narratives and the agenda that's being set through those? How's that being crafted by corporate interests and moneyed interests, and things that might be presented as like fact and straight up down the middle, not opinion, news gathering. You have to look at it from a different perspective and think a little bit deeper about it. And It's got some good books to read on that would be, classically, it would be like Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. And more recently, there's a book called Hate Inc. By an author called Matt Taibbi. And these are both, we'll link these as well in the description. They're great books to help you analyze how to be literate with the media that you consume, and how to understand some of the underlying forces that determine the narratives that are shared. So obviously being literate to all these things is super important with how you choose to inform yourself about the world around us. So there's a lot to say about that. And I think I probably will want to talk about these things in more depth another time. So with all that in mind, it's important to keep all these things in mind to understand, how and why messages are entering your ears, right? So like, what do you think about, this type of view of things? Because you were mentioning like how there's so much misinformation out there, and like, but also flipping it on its head and also saying like, you can't, you could find misinformation in the most reputable sources. You could find misinformation from the crank online, right? Like, what do you think about that? How do you maintain mindfulness in the way you're consuming with that in mind?
I just think, like you said, going back into, if you're not paying, then you're the product. And I think that a lot of the media that we end up getting seems to be quote unquote free, right? But it's actually not. And the other thing is setting intentions, making sure that you're setting intentions with what you're listening to and making sure that it's in alignment with your morals and values. And if it's not, questioning it and digging deeper. And that's where I would leave that.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Cause it's like, if someone just has a different perspective, and it's healthy to expose yourself to different perspectives from yours. But yeah, if the different perspective kind of violates your moral and ethical framework, then that's a different story. And you have to change the way that you think about it and talk about it. So yeah, I mean, media in general, obviously a huge part of being mindful in the way that you consume, the clothes you wear, the products you buy, the food you eat. We hope that you think a little bit deeper about some of these things moving forward. Maybe you already do think deeply about them, and we hope that you found some insight that might be valuable from our discussion here today. And yeah, there's just a lot still to say, like I kind of predicted at the start of the podcast, but I think it feels like a good place to wrap it up. What do you feel like?
Yeah, I think that was a really great conversation, and I hope that y'all are able to check out the links that we leave below if you're looking to dig deeper on what we're saying. And this is media that you're consuming, so be critical thinkers and let us know what your thoughts are. We really appreciate you guys being here with us.
Some of the things that we talked about today, I think, can apply in lots of different ways in life. So I hope that you found some value from this. Like Liz said, we'd love to get to hear from you and talk to you. Like, rate and review and subscribe and follow on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. All the engagement helps out. We have a YouTube channel. All of our podcasts are up on there. We've got some little clips as well. So please go and follow and subscribe and do all the things that help out in the algorithms that we were just talking about, so that we can get mindful consumption ideas blasted into people's news feeds when they might be scrolling mindlessly. That's the goal. The like and subscribe, all that stuff. And come back next time. We've got some other ideas lined up, new podcasts in the works, and more conversations to be had. So that's
Peace
it
and
for
love.
me. Signing out. See you later, guys.